Hello, students of MACS 230, Canadian Cultural Industries in Mass Media, and welcome to our 12th and final lecture in the course, by video, of course, in lieu of face-to-face instruction for the time being. I'm looking forward to finishing up our course discussion by looking today at the internet, actually, as one of the many mass media vehicles for cultural industries in Canada. And our agenda for today, as you can see from this first slide in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this lecture video, is to give a video lecture, of course, on the internet, as I've just mentioned, and then I will make some brief comments at the end to conclude the course. We would have viewed in class an episode of the Netflix television series called Schitt's Creek, populated as it is by alumni from SCTV that we looked at as a Canadian culture industry during our lecture on television. But of course, in lieu of face-to-face instruction, I will not be screening that for students. However, I will invite those that have access to it, still available on Netflix, to have a look. I think you might quite enjoy it. And as with our previous video lectures, of course, there is an accompanying PowerPoint presentation available through the Blackboard LMS in the weekly material in the same section as you found the link to this video. And as always, I will verbally cue when it's appropriate to advance to the next slide in the PowerPoint presentation. And as much as I'm able, I'll also embed these slides from the PowerPoint presentation directly into this video presentation. So at this point, I will invite everyone to proceed now to the second slide in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this lecture video. And I'd like to begin with a few comments from media theorist James Carey. And he argued some time ago that the internet should be understood as the first instance of a global communication system, one that actually realizes Marshall McLuhan's idea of the global village. And in doing so, it displaces, according to Carey, a national system that came into existence in the late 19th century with the development of initially telegraphy and railroad transportation, and later national magazines, newspapers, radio, and television, or what are referred to as the traditional mass communication silos. And certainly most of the cultural industries and mass media in Canada that we've looked at through the course fall into the categories of these traditional silos. Things like radio, television, music as an industry in general, for example. And of course, radio and television are the strongest examples. Telephone would be another one, although that's not so much a cultural industry. But these were industries of mass communication that were developed and regulated by national interests. That is to say that the United States had its own telephone and television and radio systems, and Canada had theirs, and they went down different paths in terms of the ways that it were funded. Because of the larger and more evenly spread American population, commercial interests were able to dominate the establishment of mass media industries in the United States, whereas in Canada, because the population is so narrowly focused on the southern border, as we've looked at several times, and not spread evenly throughout the country, and because the population in general was only about 1/10 of the size of the American population, of course, the development of mass media industries in Canada has been dominated significantly by government funding and mandate-driven forms of cultural industry production. James Carey suggests that today we are witnessing the emergence of a new media ecology, he calls it, which transforms the structural relations among these older media, such as print and broadcasting, and integrates them into a new center around what he calls the defining technologies of computer and satellite. And digitalization and convergence are terms that we need to look at. The internet and satellite technology have come hand in hand with the advent of what's called digitization. Or digitalization. And of course, if we were enjoying face to face instruction, I would have posed the question to the class asking, what is digitalization as far as students understand it? Because it's a term that's thrown around quite regularly, and yet it's not as well understood as people. As perhaps it should be, considering how commonly used the term is. And as you can see from the slide here, in lieu of hearing your answers to the question, I'll simply tell you digitization is the translation of information from various analog formats into patterns of ones and zeros, the computer language of binary. And these can be transmitted along cables, fiber optic networks, telephone lines, and over the air, and then reconstructed by various kinds of electronic receivers, such as computers, cellular phones, DVD players, MP3 players, and so on. And the distinction between digital and analog is perhaps really best exemplified in our experience of listening to music. You may remember your parents having a stereo at home, for example, that had a little needle that measured the output levels, and as the music beat, the needle would sway back and forth like this. And more recently, what there has been are these lights that you see, and they're just bars that bounce up and down. And this really tells us the distinction between analog. Of course, when the needle moves back and forth, you can infinitely divide the space between any position on the needle using a simple fractions of math. Whereas the bars, as they bounce up and down, of course, there's a distinct space where one bar will light up and then stop, and then perhaps another bar will light up above it when the music changes. But obviously, these bars are finite, whereas the space between the needle can be measured infinitely. The bars are finite. It's either on or it's off. And that is really the definition of binary. The binary language functionally can do two things. It can turn an electronic circuit on, or it can turn an electronic circuit off. But under the conditions of the technology of computers, in combinations of billions, of course, they can do all of the amazing things that our home computer can do, our word processors, and of course the World Wide Web and the internet. And so that's really the distinction between these analog forms of sound that are existing in real time space, infinite versions of sound. The human ear can only hear so much, or these digital versions of sound where you could actually, if you were to look at it mathematically, break down into finite sections of what's being produced in terms of what comes out of the speaker in your stereo system. And so in the past, it made sense to talk about distinct media forms, magazines, radio, television, cinema, as these completely separate analog industries. For example, if you turned your radio on that you have in your car, it can't get television signals. Or if you pick up a newspaper, of course, you can't hear the radio when you pick up the newspaper, because these analog silos were entirely separate. But these silos are of course broken down under the conditions of digitization and the internet. Almost all media content today is produced digitally, with the result that it can be distributed both in its conventional form. We can produce it digitally and then print it, so a hard copy magazine or a newspaper or over-the-air radio, and digitally. And so that it can also be distributed via digital internet in networks such as the internet to such home technological devices as your laptop computer or your iPhone. So at this point, I'll invite you to proceed now to slide number 3 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this final lecture in MACS 230, our exploration of cultural industries in Canada through the mass media. And the phenomenon of digitalization has significantly contributed to what has been called convergence. And again, if we were enjoying face-to-face instruction, I would have posed the question to the class what they understand by the term technological convergence. But of course, I'm just going to provide that in this video lecture format. And there's perhaps no better illustration of media convergence and how telecommunication has evolved than the new generation of smartphones, which act as telephones, cameras, video and audio players, personal computers, all in this one small and handheld device, linked in networks, which are then owned and controlled by communications conglomerates. And the commonality in all of these different types of technology now being converged into, for example, our iPhone, is, of course, digitization. And hence the ability for one device to send and receive input from another. And that's what is meant by the term technological convergence. And there are, of course, clear signs that news organizations and broadcasting corporations that were the backbone of Canadian cultural industries and mass media are abandoning the 20th century silo approach. For example, in 2014, there was an announcement that the newspaper publisher Post Media and the radio and television broadcaster CBC that we've looked at extensively were adopting their own respective full-fledged multi-platform strategies. So that is to say, they would maintain their traditional analog broadcasting platforms, but that these would be in addenda to the digital platforms and the digital technology that they were beginning to implement in order to use the internet as a vehicle of broadcasting. The CBC, which began radio broadcasting in the 1930s and television broadcasting in the 1950s, as we've looked at in previous lectures, it was among the first Canadian organizations actually to embrace the World Wide Web in the 1990s when it announced its, recently, even though it was the first, it was only recently, it was in 2014, in June of 2014, CBC announced its digital first approach, part of what would become a 5-year plan to shift resources from its traditional broadcasting services into a new stream of mobile content. But in order to fund this, of course, the traditional vehicles of funding for mass media, maybe less for CBC, but certainly for mass media cultural industries in general, as we know, is advertising, which we actually looked at in one of our classes as its own cultural industry for all of the creativity that goes into creating advertisements. And online advertising is very quickly taking on increasing importance, with revenues rising from $98 million in 2002 to 3.5 billion Canadian dollars in 2014. I'm sure those statistics are even more alarming in the last 5 years since these statistics were reported. But while online advertising is on the rise, much of it is coming at the expense of newspaper and conventional television advertising, as these media struggle to reinvent themselves under these new digital conditions. So in April of 2014, for example, as a result of lost advertising revenues, the CBC cut 657 positions as part of its strategy to cope with a $130 million budget shortfall that year, which is expected, of course, to lead to more job cuts. Between another estimated at the time in 2014, the estimate was that there would be close to another 1,500 job cuts by 2020. Also, in August of 2014, CTV, the sort of private version of CBC in Canadian television cultural industries, it cut 7 contract positions associated with its flagship news magazine show, W5. And so these might not seem like huge numbers in terms of the American media market that we're used to hearing statistics reported through the internet, but in terms of the size and reach of the Canadian mass media cultural industries, these are significant cuts. Global News laid off 55 people as part of a reduction of 400 jobs throughout Shaw Media. And the Star Media Group shut down the free print editions of Metro in Saskatoon, Regina, and London, Ontario, also resulting in 25 layoffs. Now, of course, these statistics are all from 2014, where the various textbooks I've harvested information from have as their latest reporting. And nevertheless, they still remain, if not accurate to today's numbers, they're relevant. They're indicative of what is happening to mass media industries under the conditions of digitalization. And it's because of the difficulties experienced by mass media industries, especially in Canada, in migrating their advertising revenues from traditional analog platforms to these new digital platforms, that the theories of another Canadian media theorist, Dallas Smythe, regarding the audience commodity have become relevant again. Now, in 1977, Dallas Smythe theorized the idea of the audience commodity, suggesting that the true commodity for media industries is not the cultural products that we have looked at, for example, like music or television programs. It's the production of the audience to sell to advertisers, which is the primary revenue source. And the problem is that previously, a television broadcaster like CBC, for example, could guarantee an advertiser a certain audience, let's say 10,000 viewers for a given show, and then charge that advertiser for that large audience. So they can go to an advertiser, CBC can go to Tim Hortons and say, hey, Tim Hortons, during this popular Canadian television program on Wednesday nights between 7 and 7:30 p.m., I'm going to have 10,000 viewers. And so for 60 seconds of advertising time, I'll charge you $10,000. And Tim Hortons would say $1 per people exposed to our advertising. That's a pretty good deal. And so they would pay $10,000. But the problem is, with these audiences now, these 10,000 viewers, the audiences are fragmented, and they're migrating to the internet. So it used to be what's called a push medium, where these advertisements could be pushed onto viewers who are watching a television program that's only screened on Wednesdays between 7 and 7:30, for example. But now we're in a pull media environment where users are going online whenever they want and watching streamed programs as they will. Now, this push-pull distinction is a little bit different than the way it's described in our textbook, and the debate over what those terms mean remains part of the ferment of cultural studies and media industry studies today. But for our purposes, that's a distinction that we can use. So these audiences are fragmented, and so CBC can no longer promise Tim Hortons, for example, 10,000 viewers at a time. And how to advertise on the internet remains uncharted terrain, even though we're seeing all sorts of new things. YouTube, for example, 10 years ago was relatively unfettered with advertising. You could just go on and watch any video. It was all user-generated content. But now you often have to sit through at least 5 seconds of a commercial before you can click forward. It's the same as games on your iPhone. Frequently, these free games will come up with every third or fourth level. You'll get an advertisement, and you can't click off. The X to click off the advertisement doesn't even come up until 5 or 10 seconds. And so this audience fragmentation, these audiences of 10,000 now fragmented onto the internet, presents a serious challenge to broadcasters, as this fragmentation leads, of course, to a lowering of the advertising rates that they could charge for any one program. And so this is a double negative at a time when they need increased revenues to accommodate the cost of transferring from analog to digital formats, a huge technological cost. Their advertising revenues are actually decreasing. And so you've got a double negative. And to combat this issue, broadcasters in general are working to do what's called re-aggregate audiences across different platforms. But as an example of what's happening in this media landscape, for instance, after paying $5.2 billion in 2013 for the rights to broadcast our old friend Hockey Night in Canada, Rogers announced that in order to maximize the size of the broadcast audience, they would begin streaming games, thereby allowing fans to catch them on any device that could access the internet. But this streaming was done only at a particular time. You couldn't necessarily record it unless you had that technology on your home computer. And so Rogers is going to its advertisers and saying, okay, so it's on television and it's streaming on our online platform, but only between these hours. And so online and television, we have an aggregate audience of 1 million. And so they'll establish their advertising rates based on that price. And in Canada, as elsewhere, but we're talking about Canada, in Canada, audience fragmentation has also led to vertical integration among media corporations, or what's called corporate convergence rather than technological convergence. As cable and satellite distributors have been purchasing television networks and specialty channels in an attempt to help distribute the cost of programming across different broadcast outlets. And you can see from this graphic competition landscape in the era of convergence for the major Canadian mass media corporations, how they all used to, at the bottom, you see the types of services that might be provided, and each one of these companies in analog conditions generally provided only one or two, but you can see from the arrows across the middle of this graphic how they've all sort of been cross-fertilizing and taking markets from each other's previous analog industries in order to try and shore up better revenues. So similarly, the proliferation of mobile media has also motivated telecommunication companies to acquire broadcast properties as they strive to obtain content for the new mobile services they're offering. And these are some of the reasons behind both Rogers and Bell's acquisitions of broadcast properties in the last 10-15 years. Communication companies that began as broadcasters, publishers, or cable or telephone companies have now become multi-platform media conglomerates, creating a much more complicated and, of course, concentrated picture of media ownership in Canada today. So 5 large companies in Canada, Astral, Bell, Quebecor, Rogers, and Shaw dominate the broadcasting industry, generating 81% of total revenues. And similarly, the 5 largest companies in telecommunications now in Canada, not broadcasting, are Ballard, MTS, Rogers, Shaw, and TELUS. And those 5 generate 85% of the national revenues in telecommunications. Now, telecommunications is not a cultural industry, but those companies, 5 for broadcasting, which is cultural industries, 5 for telecommunications, you can see variously listed across the top of this graphic, showing the convergence of corporate interests across broadcasting and telecommunications platforms in Canada. And so at this point in the video lecture, again, I'll invite you to advance to slide number 4 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation as we look at some of the ways that corporations have tried to defend their cultural industry content and properties. It's becoming increasingly difficult to track people as they move between different media, and particularly the online program distributors such as Netflix, YouTube, and Apple TV. So even though these broadcasters are making efforts to re-aggregate their audiences, it's very difficult to know where the audiences are or when the audiences might be online. And without such information, neither industry nor government agencies like the CRTC can rigorously measure or understand the impact of the services are having on Canada's mediascape. And this is really best understood, I think, in terms of the problem of ownership. So when we think about music, previously if you enjoyed music, let's say you enjoyed the music of Canadian performer Justin Bieber, you would go to Walmart and you would buy a CD of his music. Or another Canadian band that we looked at was the Guess Who. And so here's a CD of the Guess Who that I could pick up, for example, if I went and purchased it at Walmart. And it's quite easy to control this. If I buy this CD at Walmart and my friend wants a copy of this CD, they can't just walk into Walmart and grab one and say, my friend Dave already bought one. They then have to go and buy this CD themselves because it's a physical copy. And so it's very easy to control how many physical copies are sold, physical ownership of the DVD. And but if, for example, because of digitalization, I purchase these songs online, before there were protections in place, there was nothing to stop me from just emailing these songs to every one of my friends. Because there was no physical copy, there was only a digital copy in cyberspace, so to speak. It became very difficult for the producers of this music to control the physical copies of it. In a world in which works, text, music, video, and so on are stored and transferred digitally, and consequently they can be copied and distributed globally in an instant and for almost no cost, these traditional conceptions of copyright and intellectual property have become increasingly problematic, especially for century-old industries that have grown up around a more traditional copyright landscape, treating content like music, like the songs on this CD, as a form of private property. And, songs become a really good example because, early in the era of digitalization and the internet, in the early 20th century, a number of companies arose, and the whole function of these companies was to share digital copies of copyrighted material for free. Including Napster, BearShare, and LimeWire. You might remember some of these. Of course, they've all gone out of business or been forced out of business because the owners of the cultural commodity, of the music that they were sharing in this case, won court cases, particularly in the United States. So, for example, heavy metal band Metallica discovered a demo of their song I Disappear had been circulating across Napster before it was even released. So this led to it being played on several radio stations across the United States, and it alerted Metallica to the fact that their entire back catalog of studio material was also available on Napster. So on March 13th of the year 2000, Metallica filed a lawsuit against Napster, and a month later, rapper Dr. Dre, who shared a litigator and legal firm with Metallica, filed a similar lawsuit after Napster refused his written request to remove his works from its service. And then in the year 2000, Madonna's single Music was leaked onto the web, and Napster, prior to its commercial release, causing widespread media coverage. And this verified Napster use peaked with 26.4 million users worldwide in February of 2001. But also back in 2000, the American musical recording company A&M Records, along with several other recording companies through the Recording Industry Association of America, sued Napster in the A&M Records Inc. versus Napster Inc. case on grounds of contributory and vicarious copyright infringement under the U.S. Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And Napster was thus faced with several allegations from the music industry. One, that its users were directly violating copyright. Two, that Napster was responsible for contributory infringement of copyright. And three, that Napster was responsible for vicarious infringement of the plaintiff's copyrights. So in 2002, as a result of these court cases primarily, Napster announced that it was bankrupt and it sold its assets to a third party. And as you can see from the PowerPoint slide, there were other similar online companies, including what you see here is BearShare and LimeWire and several others, and they have their own histories of lawsuits and court cases which resulted in their needing to shut down for the same reason. I'm not going to sort of adumbrate the histories of those ones. Napster sort of started the lawsuit cycle in place. But over the next decade, of course, several other companies emerged and then were disbanded under the conditions of copyright lawsuits against them. But it's also interesting to note that review our discussion of the long tail from our lecture on the music industry, which you can see at the bottom of this PowerPoint slide, where when we're talking about, for example, these physical DVDs, these physical copies that, while they were very easy to control the sale of, and the distribution of them was easy to control, if somebody just grabbed one for free and walked out of Walmart, they'd readily be arrested for shoplifting. And these digital ones with that long tail and so Walmart can only actually have so many of these in their inventory because they take up physical space, but in digital cyberspace they take up no space. And so you had these online distributors who were actually operating legally now. They had acquired the rights to sell and distribute this music appropriately, but because they could keep in that long tail these digital copies on, they only need to sell one a year, and it pays for itself because there's no cost to storing it. So this is interesting in one other element in the ways that digitalization has caused a loss to the cultural industry's revenue generation, not through advertising per se, but again, if we take this example of this CD of the Guess Who, and if I show you the back of it, you can see the number of tracks that are on it. In this case, there's 18 tracks. And if I went to Walmart to buy this DVD or CD, it probably cost me about $18. And so I would spend $18 and I would buy all of those 18 songs. But it doesn't mean I wanted all 18 of those songs. I'd probably be willing to pay $18 for the CD if I only liked 8 of the songs. But now with these services that are available like iTunes, you can buy only one song. It might be a little bit more, right? So I might just want to buy song number 6, and it might cost me $1.29 instead of the dollar example that I just gave. But the problem is, in terms of economies of scale, I'm only buying that one song. So while the distribution company gets a little bit more per song, they're selling, in this example, 17 fewer songs. So of course, the loss from even legal sales of songs in these digitalized distribution networks was significant. So that's another revenue or economic loss on top of the advertising dollars that were lost in traditional broadcasting. So at this point, as we proceed through our discussion of the internet as a vehicle for cultural industries in Canada, I will invite you to advance now to slide number 5 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation available on the Blackboard LMS to this video lecture. And so at the same time that these traditional broadcasting silos were struggling with the long tail and with online distribution services that were cutting into revenues, all of the phenomena that resulted from digitalization, the CRTC, recognizing the near impossibility of policing the internet, which was, as James Carey pointed out, a global phenomenon rather than a national phenomenon, began relaxing what we've called CanCon, their Canadian content regulations that worked so well in the second half of the 20th century to protect and even sponsor and promote Canadian cultural industry production, particularly in the realms of music. So in order to protect Canadian cultural production from the American economies of scale issue, in which it was less expensive for Canadian broadcasters to simply purchase American cultural commodities and broadcast those instead of paying the higher price for Canadian ones. The CRTC requires AM and FM radio stations that specialize in popular music to devote at least 35% of their playtime to Canadian selections. And prior, as we've looked at before, to the enactment of radio content regulations, less than 5% of the music played on radio stations in Canada was by Canadian artists. But as I said, the CRTC began a process of relaxing these regulations in 2015, following shortly on the heels of the rise of Netflix streaming in Canada, which began in 2010. And the streaming services like Netflix are referred to as OTT, or over the top. Unlike broadcast network, which was transferred through national industries of cable distribution or even standard broadcasting radio wave distribution. It's coming in over the top of these national broadcasting distribution vehicles through the global internet. So these over-the-top program distributors like Netflix, Google, and Apple TV are circumventing regulations, undermining the viability of Canadian screen industries, and raising new concerns about cultural sovereignty in the face of American media imperialism. And however, it's not necessarily all bad. There has been some hopeful, if not idealistic, prognostications about what internet cultural industries might bring positively to our social interests. The specific areas in which improvement has been purported to arise for communications due to the internet are customarily health interests, culture interests, and education interests. However, time and again, historically, whenever a new mass medium has been introduced, it's been met with severe irrational anxiety about the way it would destroy traditional society, in conjunction with some of these hopeful prognostications that television would be the new medium of available education to young people right in their home. However, what has proven to be the case with all of these, and again with the internet in the 21st century, is that neither satellites nor the internet nor computers or any technology is likely to bring about any sort of a new egalitarian world under the conditions of commercial interests and mass media corporations dominating the industry landscape. And so, one way of approaching this is the need to return to our friend from the very first lecture, Canadian media scholar Harold Innish, and his notions of the bias of information. And rather than just sort of panicking, the internet is, the industries are falling apart, and yet the corporations are converging to become more and more powerful, we might ask, what biases will be introduced into society by the ability to collect information on just about everything, or by the ability to copy easily every information package. And this is one of the things that makes the examination of media cultural industries so fascinating to scholars in the present tense, is that this history of these new biases that are being introduced and the effects that they'll have on society and on industries in general are occurring underneath our feet. They're happening as we speak. We're watching them happen. We're living through them happening, and we're participating in the direction and the development that these take simply by being Netflix or YouTube users. And so at this point, I'll ask that you proceed to slide 6 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation in my efforts to conclude our discussion of the internet and perhaps look actually at some of the content of these cultural industries. And as perhaps somewhat disheartened as I may have sounded in my discussion of these changes under the conditions of the internet and digitalization, it's not all bad. It depends on which perspective you're looking at it. And there's a bit of a two-way street. Canadian communication practices, government policy formation, and the activities of our cultural industries, they're not confined by municipal, provincial, or national borders under the conditions of globalization and the internet. In an era of globalization, national communication systems can be seen really as subsystems within a much larger and increasingly integrated global telecommunication system and media system. And globalization also means that Canadian media producers and distributors participate in an increasingly global marketplace, which may or may not be bad depending on your perspective of the free market and the protection of cultural industries on nationalist levels. And so a little bit of history to sort of preview this idea. In 1995 and 96, the Canadian Television and Cable Production Fund was created. And the fund is a private-public partnership between the federal government of Canada and the cable and satellite television industry, with Telefilm administering the equity investment component of the fund. And in 1998, Telefilm Canada created a 5-year, $30 million multimedia fund, aptly named the Multimedia Fund, with which to support Canadian work in the new digital era. And the fund helps Canadians in multimedia to compete effectively in the new technologies arena. Now, in 2002, these two are merged into in 2010, these two are merged into the Canada Media Fund. And yet, while these funds are hopeful, and it's evidence that the Canadian government is aware of the need to perhaps bolster and support its industry under the conditions of the internet and digitalization, these funds really do remain minimal when compared against global costs. If you remember our discussion of Canadian cinema across 2 lectures, there were the 3 sectors: production, distribution, and exhibition within Canada. And now that the internet has sort of really shattered these industry silos themselves, just with distribution occurring over the top, cross-border collaboration in the new millennium has become the standard for Canadian film production. And perhaps the best example of this is the series of films Resident Evil, in which I think all but one of the 6 or 7 films in the series had significant Canadian production inputs. And Canada is no stranger to co-productions. As international media scholar Menjanath Pendikar points out in his book, Canadian Dreams and American Control, he says co-production is the principal mechanism used by film and television producers in Canada to pool capital and labor from around the world and have market access globally. Given the uncertainties of access to capital and markets, compounded by the relatively small domestic markets in Canada, Canadian producers look outside the country to compete in the international financing game of feature film production. But the problem, the long tradition of attempting to protect sovereign Canadian media production, from American media domination remains. It remains an issue, and it's become exacerbated under the conditions of over-the-top internet distribution when the Canadian government and the CRTC have not been able to protect its domestic cultural industries in the ways that it has in the past. In fact, in 2011, Telefilm actually announced a new system to measure the success of a Canadian film that takes into account the sales of a film's worldwide rights and gives points based on on film festival appearances and awards. So the old American measure of domestic box office receipts has been almost entirely abandoned. And in 2012, the Canadian federal budget cut funding for the National Film Board of Canada, which we looked at in one of our 2 lectures on Canadian cinema, and Telefilm Canada by 10%. And today, following a new 4-year plan, Telefilm has made stimulating demand for Canadian screen-based content one of its top priorities. That is, Telefilm is now looking at trying to interest audiences not only in Canada but internationally in the cultural commodities that it's producing. But, all in all, the long-standing problem of Canada being concerned with American media imperialism and making efforts to protect itself and bolster its industry in terms of very particularly nationalist interests. In fact, very little has changed. In many ways, we might be look at it as having come full circle with these nationalist interests. In 2014, the Feds announced their Digital Canada 150 program, which offers little in the way of new initiatives, although it did promise a policy that is underscored by 5 key pillars. connecting Canadians, protecting Canadians, economic opportunities for Canadians, digital government for Canadians, and of course, Canadian content. And as we know, none of those ideas or initiatives are new. And it remains to be seen what these policies, which are emerging as we speak, they're being published almost daily, what these policies will do to maintain these very nationalist interests of media production and cultural industries. And so at this point, I'll ask that you proceed to the seventh and final slide in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this video lecture for the topic of the internet as a cultural industry in our course, Canadian Cultural Industries in the Mass Media. And, I'll conclude by, putting these industry woes aside and these questionable national interests aside, as the internet continues to provide an expanding choice of largely foreign news and entertainment products such as MSNBC, Netflix, YouTube, and Apple TV, and the proportion of Canadian alternatives available continues to shrink relatively, there are surely some really cool Canadian contributions that are worth looking at, and maybe this is the future for Canadian media, that rather than national sovereignty interests, just expanded international production will be of some value. So, for example, Netflix's Lost in Space features a Canadian actress, Molly Parker, who years ago starred in a Canadian, very, very Canadian film production called Kissed, about a young woman who was only able to enjoy sexual relations with dead people, typically Canadian feel-good comedy. And another one is Schitt's Creek, which features SCTV alumni Eugene Levy, who you might recognize from the American Pie television series, and Catherine O'Hara, as well as a couple of Eugene Levy's actual kids, one of whom is seen here in this promotional image for the television show, the Canadian Netflix television show Schitt's Creek. And, at this point in the class, I was going to screen season 3, episode 9, called The Affair, which is a great one of the many great episodes of this now discontinued television series, which is still available, of course, through the streaming services of Netflix. And because Netflix is an external commercial industry, I can't even upload a link to it reasonably onto Blackboard. But for those of you that have access to it through either Netflix or through some other online streaming platform, I really will invite you to have a look at Schitt's Creek as an example of the types of very Canadian-inflected cultural industries, media products being produced under the conditions of digitalization and the internet. And on that note, I will conclude the lecture and the course. Actually, I'll conclude the course from my side of the video lecture screen. I'd like to thank all of you for your diligent participation and attention, and for the efforts it's taken for all of us to transfer from the pleasures of face-to-face instruction to these online formats and videos. Overall, it's certainly been a real treat for me to share with you all the fascinating, if not significantly under-celebrated phenomena of the Canadian media industries and their cultural contributions and simply their cultural products. And I invite you to take any of the insights that you've acquired in the course into your own future explorations of media culture, perhaps as a touchstone for the types of media cultural industries that are available in the world outside of the dominance of American media imperialism. So thanks to all. Stay safe, and good luck with your final written submissions and with the final quiz to be conducted electronically next week.